Okay, so once again, thank you for joining today. We're going to be talking about the Global Carbon Council's methodology for renewable energy generation for projects supplying electricity to the grid or captive consumers. And this methodology is referred to as GCCM001. Our agenda today will be to go over some information about Envision blockchain, a Guardian overview. We'll do a quick recap of previous webinars and where you could find that. Then we'll talk about carbon credits and methodologies, policy development checklists, some information that's specific to this methodology. And then we'll look at our schemas and workflows. This would be our Excel and all of the business processes that we've outlined. And then we'll go into Managed Guardian Service to do a live demo of this policy. Envision Blockchain Solutions builds applications for the Web3 space, and we focus on guiding organizations through 3 major milestones on their Web3 journey: use case analysis, proof of concept development, scaled deployments, and we're also the builders and maintainers of the Guardian. Since 2020, the open source Guardian maintained by Envision Blockchain with support from HBAR Foundation and Worlds Labs has utilized Hedera's public network to enable transparent, auditable, and traceable documentation of emission process and life cycles of digital environmental tokens. In 2021, leveraging its expertise, Envision Blockchain introduced the Managed Guardian Service, also known as MGS, and this is a SaaS solution tailored for the carbon market to simplify environmental application development. MGS launched in 2022, and it supports organizations in creating traceable environmental tokens on Hedera's ledger, advancing global sustainability efforts. Now, going into some of our previous webinars, this is just a shorter list of all of the ones we've covered, but you'll see that we have different methodologies like VM17, VM42, which are for agriculture and land management. We've also covered some that are comparing Vera's methodologies for afforestation, reforestation with gold standards. And we've also done some methodologies from CDM. But you could find all of these on our YouTube channel at Envision Blockchain. And even if you wanted to watch today's presentation later on, you could also find that on our YouTube channel. So you'll hear us talk about carbon credits and methodologies a lot, and I think it's great to explain what each one is. So carbon credit represents a measurable reduction or removal of 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide or its equivalent from the atmosphere. It's awarded to projects that successfully reduce greenhouse gas emissions, providing a way to offset emissions and support environmental sustainability. Then when we talk about methodologies, this is going to be specific to carbon credits, and it outlines the actions and calculations required to determine the emission reductions or removals associated with a project. It includes scientifically informed steps to estimate the impact on carbon emissions with over 400 methodologies available, varying in quality, complexity, and feasibility. And a lot of the ones that you'll see within our previous webinars are coming from Vera, CDM, which is Clean Development Mechanism, Gold Standard, and today we'll be covering one from the Global Carbon Council. Now, when we're looking at developing these policies, there are certain steps that we follow as environmental consultants or even our development team. So the first stage is always the research and preparation. You want to make sure you have an understanding of what project you're taking on, what are the activities included in there, location, just to make sure that the methodology that you select in that second stage is appropriate for your project. So once you've selected that methodology, you want to make sure that you're reading through these documents, and these could be PDFs that have many pages. Some are as short as 10, and it could go up to 300 pages, maybe even more. But you're just making sure that you're meeting those applicability requirements that they've outlined, and that you're going to have all the data available to be able to fulfill the calculations that they're requiring of you in order to have that quantification of all of the environmental benefits that you've accomplished. Then we move into that third stage, which is workflow research. And here you're outlining all of the business processes that these registries or standards providers would usually follow. So the first step is designing it. This could be within a PowerPoint or anything that you like to outline these different blocks of information. And what you're really covering in here are what are the different actors, so roles that we're going to include in this policy. It can be your project developer or a project owner, a registry, which could be your admin account, and any verifiers that are playing a role in here too. And then we're going to outline what is each step that they have to accomplish within this timeline. The fourth stage here is going to be mapping quantification approaches. So as I previously mentioned, we have these PDFs that outline several equations that could be used. They're not always all relevant to your project, even if the methodology is. So you want to make sure you're only including the ones that are needed for your project and those environmental quantifications that need to occur. And then we move into the Excel. So within the Guardian, you can find an Excel template that you could download. You could always import this in, export it back out. But what you're outlining here are what are all the fields that we have to capture? What are the questions we need to ask the user? All the data points we need to collect in order to satisfy the requirements for this methodology. And then we move into the policy workflow engine. So here it might get a little more technical where you're outlining these blocks of information, what's coming in, what's going out, who needs to submit certain documents, who needs to approve or reject certain documents, where do these calculations live. All of that's going to occur within the policy workflow engine, and that's where you get to move that information around and make sure that your policy is executing correctly. You have everything that you've outlined within your Excel and within that workflow design captured within this policy. Now moving into GCCM001, this is going to be a set of rules for renewable energy projects like solar or wind farms to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and earn carbon credits. So some of the types of projects we could see here are solar farms. It could be a large-scale solar panel generating electricity, wind farms, onshore or offshore, tidal and wave energy. And just a simple example here could be that I have a company that's building a new wind farm to provide electricity to a small town, and I'm reducing the need to pull power from a coal-fired power plant. So I'm doing something that's benefiting the environment, and I can use this methodology to earn some carbon credit. Now, within this methodology, they do mention battery energy storage systems that can be used. And the purpose here is just to store that excess energy for use when production is low. This could be at night for a solar farm, or you can have lower energy coming in when maybe the wind isn't blowing strong on one day when you're depending on that. So we have these different installation types like new projects, which will be referred to as greenfields. These can be built alongside new renewable plants or existing projects, which they'll refer to as retrofit. And this is just adding the battery energy storage systems to already operating renewable plants. They also include some usage rules for these battery energy storage systems, which would be that you could only use grid electricity in emergencies and no more than 2% for the total generated power. Otherwise, the project will lose those carbon credits. They won't be issued in the first place, and you wouldn't have those emission reductions in order to have these carbon credits approved by a verifier or by the registry themselves. And now what's not allowed with this methodology is combined heat and power, no fossil fuel use, and there are restrictions for the battery energy storage systems. So if it's using any harmful refrigerants or excessive grid power, then it would be excluded from this project. And with these environmental projects, we do hear a lot about SDGs and the Sustainable Development Goals. These are a set of 17 global objectives established by the United Nations to address pressing environmental, social, and economic challenges. And they aim to create a more equitable and sustainable world by 2030, focusing on issues such as poverty and inequality, climate action, and peace. This specific project will be targeting SDG 13, which is climate action, and SDG 1 for renewable energy. But that doesn't mean that you can't include other SDGs in here. The only difference from registering this project with GCC themselves is that they can issue credits that have labels. So they offer SDG plus labels that can be attached to that credit. What we do here is capture all of the data, and all of that data will be visible and can be used to make these claims as well later down the road, maybe with a marketplace. And this also applies to CORSIA. You'll also see that they have credits issued with those CORSIA labels. We can collect all of that data and it can be verified later on. And now we're moving into the schemas and workflows. So this first schema that you're going to see is just an example of how we capture this information in these Excel templates. And we can actually exit out of here and look at the actual Excel. So here you'll see that we have these different columns like required field type, parameter, visibility, question, if we're allowing multiple answers and a sample answer. And what we want to do here is collect all of the information that we need. So in this specific sheet, we're talking about the project owner. When we're doing this live demo, you'll see that when I select the user to be the project owner, they're going to have to fill out this form where we collect their name, some information about what company they're associated with, and maybe some private information here like a passport number. But within Guardian, we do have something called selected disclosure, and we can make sure that these fields remain private and they're only visible by those who are approved. So you wouldn't see this in that public network as it would be displayed as private. And we can look at that within the Guardian UI when we get to the live demo. But you'll see that we have these different sheets here. These are identifying different schemas. So we have the project owner, we have the verifier. Again, we're collecting information here when they create their account, what we're requiring as information we have to capture before you could ever select submit. And if it's optional, we could always put no in here. The field type, if it's a string, then that's going to be all types of information that could be submitted, like letters, numbers, these dashes. We have emails that are collected, URLs, but we're defining all of that previously. And then we have our questions that we ask. We can allow multiple answers. So maybe I have different websites that I want to collect here. I could put yes here and allow the user to input multiple websites. Within this methodology, they do allow for an investment analysis. This is optional, but we would capture a URL link here to their spreadsheet where they outline that investment analysis. And you'll see that we have the requirement as no, since this is optional as defined by the methodology and by GCC. And then we move into things like additionality determination, where we use tools that come from CDM. And the user has the option to select which one they would like to use to prove that their project is additional and has an environmental benefit. Then we move into these forms that can be pretty long. They collect a lot of information about the project. This is all going to be visible to the verifiers, to the registry. But in here, we would have our project submission form. You'll see that we have a schema like project owner. This is going to be a sub-schema that lives within the project submission form. We could reuse this, but you'll see we identify that as a sub-schema. And then we have our main ones that would be visible again to the registry, to the project owner. And we have this verification report, a monitoring report, and an emission reduction verification report. So all of these are coming from what would usually be a Word document for the registry. They would collect all of this information from specific roles like project owners, a verifier, and these Word documents move around from the registry to the project owner to the steering committee. They all have to approve this. And then we capture calculations in these sheets, like the baseline emissions for different cases. So it depends on the activity and what the user is selecting here. Project emissions, leakage emissions, and finally the emission reductions. And that's what we'll see in our demo today. And then we have the workflow. So when we go into our demo, we're going to be doing every single step that you see here. What we're not going to do is click the reject button, as it'll throw us back into that previous step. But it is something that you can play around with if you get to use this policy within Guardian. So you'll see that we have different users like a project owner, the verifier, Global Carbon Council as GCC, and GCC Steering Committee. Then if we start all the way to this top left here, we have the project owner registering their account, where they're going to input all of that information we saw in the Excel, which is their company and personal information. Then we have the verifier registering their account, also inputting their company and personal information, and GCC would also create an account, but we're not collecting info from them in those forms that you saw. Then GCC would go ahead and approve these accounts, making sure that everything's consistent, all the data is there that they need, and they could go ahead and click an approve button. Then we move back to the project owner. They're going to go ahead and complete that project submission form, and optionally they can submit an investment analysis form, submit that to GCC, where GCC is again checking for completeness, and they can either approve or reject that. If it's rejected, it does go back to the project owner where they have to fill it out again and resubmit. And then we move to the GCC operations team. So once that's been approved, they will check it again, assign that unique reference submission number, which we'll see as a pop-up window where you can input that. And the project owner will have to go ahead and assign a project verifier. So in this specific policy, we're going to see two verifiers. One will be checking the project submission form, and a different verifier has to be used to check the monitoring report. Now we're back to the project verifier where they can complete this verification report, submit it to GCC where they can either approve or reject. If it all looks correct, we move into that approval step. And they're going to go ahead and assess this document and determine if the recommendations that the verifier has made are aligned with the recommendations that they have. If it's not, then we're going to have a button where they can go ahead and leave a comment for feedback for the GCC steering committee to see and know that our recommendations were not aligned with the verifier. But if it is, they can just click an approve button, and the GCC steering committee has access to this document now, where they can decide if this project is going to be registered or if it stops here. So this workflow can come to a complete stop if they decide that it's not following the requirements and we're not going to register it. So staying with the happy path, we say that yes, it does align with all of the requirements. We're going to approve this. The project owner can now start implementing their project activities, measuring and monitoring their parameters that are needed for the project monitoring report. And they can start filling that out and finally submit it to the GCC. Again, their operations team. They're going to do that completeness check, make sure that it's following requirements, and they can approve it. They can also reject here. Now, the project owner will have to assign that new verifier that I mentioned, so it cannot be the same one that was used for the first verification. It has to be a new verifier, and they can go ahead and check that monitoring report, make sure that it's following everything. This can also include site visits where there'll be data collected for all the activities that they conducted on site, who did they talk to, and what was the outcome. And then once that's been submitted, the GCC operations team will again check, make sure everything has been filled out, and approve this document. And then we move back to the similar step that we had here where the recommendations can either be aligned with the verifier or not, and we'll allow for comments if it's not. If it is, you can just click an approval button, and the GCC steering committee will decide to issue these credits or issue them or not issue. And then we'll finally get to that issuance if it did meet all the requirements and they click that approval button there. So how do we calculate these credits? The first step is always these baseline emissions, where we're going to follow what the methodology outlines, and we need data points to capture this calculation. So you'll see here that we have the baseline emissions for a specific year would come from the quantity of net electricity generation that is produced and fed into the grid or supplied to the recipient captive user. And then we have that CO2 emission factor that we'll multiply it against. But there's different ways to get this emission factor as outlined by the methodology, and it can come from a specific tool known as Tool 7 from CDM. It could also be the latest available emission factor of that grid in the country, approved by the CDM standardized baseline, the latest version of the emission factor for that grid in a country is approved by the relevant national authority. Latest IFI combined margin factor published on the UNFCCC website, or that last option would be the latest published emission factor derived by the IEA. And that can only be used if the 4 previous options are not available. And I forgot to mention, this would only be for case 1, which is the greenfield renewable energy generation project activities that have or don't have those battery energy storage systems. But if you have case 2, which would be project activities where battery energy storage systems are installed as a retrofit to an existing renewable energy generation project activity, then you would follow this equation. And it's very similar, except the first data point that we would need would be the incremental amount of net electricity generation that is produced due to the installation of those battery energy storage systems. And that's fed into the grid or supplied to the recipient captive user. But for the emission factors, we would still follow that same logic of you have 5 different options you can select. And you'll see that in that demo as well, where we have drop downs, you can choose it. If you chose that first one, it would redirect you to tool 7, where you can now input data for it. If you chose the other options, then you would supply us with that value. And then for the project emissions, we can use the same tool, but for different types of activities. So if electricity is consumed from the grid, we have these following sources that need to be accounted for. So if there's CO2 emissions from on-site consumption of electricity by the project activity, we'll use tool 5. And again, within the Guardian, we'll redirect you to tool 5. It can be seen as like a mini methodology or mini policy where we collect all the data points there to get that value as an output. And then for grid power, for charging of those battery energy storage systems in emergency situations, we'd also have to calculate any emissions that come from that using tool 5. And it's important to know, usually we'll have a calculation for leakage, but in this methodology, there is no leakage, so we hard code that to 0. And when we run this final emission reductions calculation, which would be the baseline minus the project emissions minus the leakage, you'll see an automatic 0 for leakage. But the baseline values and project values would come from those previous equations that we have already conducted. And now we could move into the Guardian, where we're going to demo this policy live. So before we get started here with this specific policy, I'm going to take you on a quick tour. So if I select Manage Guardian Service, it'll take me to our user profile. Here you can see our DID document, BC document for this account, the balance of HBAR, our hedera account ID, the DID associated with my account, the user topic, and initialization topic. And you'll see we have 2 dropdowns, our policies and tokens. I'm going to select the dropdown for policies, where I see schemas, artifacts, modules, policies again, and tools. We're going to select schemas. And now if I had multiple policies imported into my account here, you'll see that I can filter this, but I only have this one. So all of the schemas that we're seeing here are for GCCM001. And you'll see we have our emission reductions, baselines, baseline for case 1, for case 2. This is going to be everything that was outlined within those Excels. So it can be the documents that we're going to see as a whole when I'm verifying that information as a registry or as a verifier, or the forms that I'm filling out as the project owner. So in here, you'll see this is going to be the emission reductions. We're getting a number back out. It is hidden, as this is going to run an auto calculation. That equation that was shown there will be used after the user submits their data. We also have it for our baselines, project emissions, and leakage emissions. So these were all those data points we needed in order to get that emission reductions. And as I mentioned before, you can always get the Excel template directly from Guardian by clicking on this button here. It will download it to your computer and have a simple example that can guide you through the Excel as to how you can use it. And if I were to create a schema from scratch, maybe I have a simple policy I'm creating, I could always use the UI and do this myself here before ever having to get into an Excel. So I can just outline the field I want to capture, the type of information we're collecting here. Is it a number, string, URL? and if it's going to be required or not. So we have required, this would be optional, and if I want to hide this from the user, I can always click hidden. Now, for what I mentioned earlier of selected disclosure, if I have a field that should be private, I can make this encrypted. And you'll see that now we have a checkbox for private. So I could always do that as well. And I think before we get started here, it's also good to point out the token that we're using here. So for this policy, it's been named ACC, and you'll see that within this tokens tab. And so when we issue credits, you'll see this labeling representing it at the end of this demo. So I've already set this to dry run. Usually you would go ahead and import your policy using this button here where you could import it from a file within your computer, just making sure that it is a policy file. You could import from IPFS using a timestamp, and this can also be found within our GitHub, or you can use our open source policies and just directly import them through there. So I can open all of the ones that we've already digitized from CDM, and you'll see them outlined here. I can just select one and click import, and you'll see that reflect in your policies tab here. So being that we are in dry run, I can navigate through all of our users using this one account instead of having to create new accounts with new emails for each one of them. And all of the credits that we're issuing today will be through testnet. So let's go ahead and click register. And now that's loaded, I can go ahead and start creating these users. So in our workflow, we outline that we have our project owner, we have the registry, which would be our administrator today. We also have verifiers, but we're going to have 2 verifiers and the steering committee. So to do this, I can click create user. I'm going to create one more before we start assigning roles. And then we can create the other user accounts after. So now I'm clicking on virtual user 1, and I'll assign this to the project owner. Now by selecting next, we're going to see this form pop up, and the project owner would have to submit some information about themselves and about the company that they work for. Okay, so we'll see all of that outlined here, like the legal name, headquarters, this legal form, what sector. As you can see, this would be optional, the website, email address, anything that's required, you'll see this above it. And again, we have already enabled selected disclosure for the fields that do collect any license or passport numbers, date of birth. Being that we do have a lot of forms to fill out today, I will be filling this out a little different. Usually you would go ahead and submit your information here by typing it in, but we're trying to keep this demo within our time frame so everyone can see the outcome. Okay, so just to go through it before we submit it, you'll see that we have our legal name here. All of this is going to be sample information. So you'll see we have 123 Main Street, just to show you what it could look like. And so we'll collect all of that information there. For this field, we would collect an image. You could do this by clicking on this paperclip here to collect any supporting evidence. And then we can click create. Now we'll see it says waiting for approval. Normally I'd go back to the administrator, but I do want to create the verifier's account as well, so we can get them both approved when we move to the admin account. And now here I'll select that verifier role and click next. So again, the verifier has their own form to fill. It is collecting information that is different from the project owner's form. We'll have the name of the approved project verifier. This could also be their company name and their reference number, the contact person's name, phone number, email, company email, websites, the type of accreditation they have. So you'll see we have different options here, and the date of their credentials. So just an example of what that looks like. Here we have the company name, their reference number, the contact person's name, their phone number, email address, company email, that website. We're going to say that they have a CDM accreditation and the date for that. And then you'll also sometimes see a URL for their credentials as well. And then here you're going to see this window pop up as well. We're just collecting information about the types of scopes that they're approved to verify. And we have some sample information here. And then you can click create. Now I'm going back to the administrator. This could also be referred to as a standard registry, where they're going to see all of the information submitted by each role, and they can go ahead and approve these accounts. So here I'm in the project owners tab. I'm seeing the name of this company or what the project owner is identifying as, and we can open the document that they've submitted, see when it was submitted, the date associated with their account, the issuance date, and we see all of that info that was sent over. And then we could go ahead and click approve or reject. So I'm going to select approve and move into the next tab once this has loaded. Okay, so now we're in the verifier. We can see the information they've submitted. Again, by clicking on this document, you get to see all the details. And we can approve or reject. I'm selecting approve. I'm just creating one last user before we move into filling out the project submission form, which is going to be the GCC steering committee. So now we see that reflecting here. We have virtual user 3. By clicking on them, I can assign that role. And keeping in mind that we do have multiple verifiers that will be used today, so you can always create a user throughout this process and assign their role. If they need to be approved, you could always go back to that administrator's account and approve it. And just a reminder that we are on dry run, so I can access all of this through my one account here. But if this was on mainnet, we would have different logins that we have to use in order to navigate around each user. So I'm clicking on the GCC steering committee. There's no form that they have to fill out. We're just assigning this role. And then you could also see that each one of these users are going to have their own progress bar here of the different things that they need to accomplish throughout the workflow. And we'll move through each one of these tabs as we go. So now we're moving into the project submission form. I can go back to my project owner's account, which is virtual user 1. And to add this project, you'll see this create project button. Now you're going to see this form that has a lot of data points we have to collect. So I'm just going to plug in this information and then we could walk through what was collected within this form. And now usually you can use this test button to fill out information. If I selected it now, we would see fields like example 1, maybe if there's a numerical field. You can also edit that within the schemas and put in your test data. But for this policy, there are going to be certain fields that are referenced within other forms, and it can just complicate it and maybe make it difficult to submit the form if we do use example data that hasn't really been verified. Okay, so here we're seeing the title of the project activity. You can outline the version number of this project submission form. So maybe you've had to work on it several times. It's come back to you several times. So we could use an example here of 7, the date of completion, the project owner, the country where the activity is located. And then you'll also see that we could add these coordinates and see the location here. So again, this is all just example data. Now here we would select the project type, but as we've outlined here, this policy workflow is only for project type A1. There would be different workflow requirements for the other types of projects. A1 is going to be the one that's most commonly used. You're starting the project timelines on a more usual basis instead of having retroactive data that's being used. Another type of project type would be if you're bringing in a project that's maybe been registered to CDM already, and now you're bringing in it to this new registry, then you would have different requirements there too. Then we're just outlining the methodology that was applied, the GHG sectoral scopes associated with it, any applicability rules. You can choose the third-party verification here. So there usually are multiple options here. Maybe they're checking for those CORSIA requirements, the SCG requirements. For this policy, we're only outlining the GHG emission reductions for those approved carbon credits. Purpose and the general description of this project activity, and we're again collecting the geographic coordinates. And then we just have information about the owner here, the period of this project. So it would be for a 10-year crediting period. We have those dates and the entities involved. And then you could also outline an example like this. We're not going to be issuing 1 million credits today, but this is just an example that we could demonstrate. Then we're going to reference again that methodology. But overall, we're collecting information about the project, the owner. For the project submission form, we do want to outline additionality. You'll see that we've selected tool 1, and I would select yes or no here. By selecting yes, that this project activity is the first of its kind, it's automatically additional, but we can collect information to justify this answer as well, and you would put that in that field there. Then we're going to outline what estimation approach we're using to calculate these environmental benefits, any data points that we're using, where did we get that data point from, so you'll see that reference, the data unit, description, how it was measured and calculated, the data source, what value are you using, any measuring or monitoring equipment. This could be used more when you're moving into your monitoring reports as well. And again, for these fields too, so they say not applicable now, but when we move into that monitoring report, you'll see information in there. And then we just offer a summary here of what would be the baselines, project emissions, leakage. Again, these are just sample values for today. We're going to be minting a smaller number just to get this going a little faster. And then it's important to note that all of these requirements were not outlined by us. This was coming from what we would normally see collected for projects registering under Global Carbon Council. These are all the things that they set as required and are needed in order to keep this project moving and make sure that they get to that issuance of credits. And once you have all of this filled out, you can always leave the optional fields empty and it's not going to cause a problem here. We've defined it that way. Then you'll see this create button turn a dark purple and you can go ahead and click it. So now we see this investment analysis button show up. This is optional. We could click it just to see what's in there, but you would be providing a URL link to your spreadsheet that has that investment analysis, and you could always add that in here, click create, and it'll be shown to the administrator and the verifiers, but this is optional, so we're not going to be submitting that today. Now what we're going to do is continue this workflow of going to the administrator, where they have to check for completeness and approve or reject. I'm going to go ahead and click on project submissions. That's where our document should be. So here you'll get to see there's any history associated with the progress of this. So you'll see that we're just waiting for approval right now. You see the title of the project that's been submitted, and we can open up this document and see everything that we submitted, when it was submitted. So you'll see that here, and who is it coming from. But again, you're going to see everything that was in there, and we'll also have some additional fields included in here, which are associated with those auto calculations that occur. So I can show you as an example, we have fields that were already input within the form from the project user, like this value of 100, this emission factor here, but we didn't input this value. So this occurred after we submitted the form. Guardian went ahead and ran the calculation to have an estimate of these emission reductions based off of these two values, which is following this approach that we selected of case 1, which would be to follow this calculation approach. And then we'll see that here. We'll also see an emission reductions, which is going to be the baseline minus the project emissions minus the leakage. We get this output. Now, once I verified all of that, make sure that all of the fields have been filled out, everything looks good, then I could go ahead and click approve. If I selected reject, it would go back to the project owner and they need to resubmit this document. Now here we see this pop-up window for a submission number. I'm going to put just an example value here of S102 and click save. Okay, so our next step here is to go back to the project owner. I have to assign a verifier to this project. So if there are multiple verifiers already with active accounts, I would have a list to choose through, but I've only created one verifier account for this demo and we'll only see one option in our dropdown. Okay, so this is the dropdown where you could go ahead and assign a verifier. I'm going to select this one here. And once that loads, then we can go ahead and move into the verifier's account, check all of this information and make sure it looks correct. So our verifier here was virtual user 2, just navigating to their account. And now we see that we have this project that's been sent over to us. We can view the document, see everything that the administrator had access to. So all of that information associated with the project, with the baseline emissions, project emissions, leakage, and those emission reductions that they're estimating. We also see this number here of the project submission number that's been added to this project by the administrator. And I can add a verification report. So once again, I'm going to go ahead and populate all of these fields, and then we could take a quick look at what we're collecting here. Okay, so I have the name of the verifier, the type of credential that I have if I'm the verifier here, the website to my credentials, what I'm approved to verify, the date of my credentials when it's valid through. So I have 2 years that I could use it, the title of the project that I'm verifying and the version number, as well as the date that it was submitted and the title of the project activity. You'll also see the submission reference number in here, just to make sure that we're verifying the same project that was submitted and there's no issues there. And then we have more information about the project, what type of project was it, the completion date of their local stakeholder consultation, completion date of the global stakeholder consultation, and then we'll collect some information about that. You'll see locations of the project, methodologies that were used, and then some information about the verifier. So the report that they're filling out, what date. We can also collect a signature here using an image. And then we have information about the verification team. So you'll see that I've just put some example information in here. but we're also collecting what type of involvement they had. So what activities were they doing? Was it desk, document review, on-site inspections, interviews, or project verification findings? And we could always add different roles here by clicking this button. So maybe I have 5 different verifiers in my team. I can always click this 5 times and have information for them as well. And then we have the technical reviewer and info about their role. What were they doing, the last name, first name, and their affiliation. We have information about the desk and document review. And just making sure that we're satisfying all of the requirements that a verifier is listed within their verification report. And again, these are Word documents within the registry's resources. So they're already set with the type of info that they need to collect. They just need to fill out those boxes and send those using a portal. But again, there could be times where they don't fill out something that was listed as required, and it's a Word document, so they can always send it. Someone will find that it wasn't filled out, and now we're having to send that back, making sure that they satisfy all of the requirements. Where here, if it's required and you left it empty, you're not going to be able to submit this form. So it's always important, if maybe you're creating a policy, to make sure you're setting everything you want to be submitted as required. And if it's optional, then you could always list it as that. And like here, I don't have to fill this out because we've already predefined it as optional, and I can still submit this form. And now we're just seeing that reference number for this project. So I'm submitting this verification report. This should go to the administrator now, and the administrator will decide if what the verifier found throughout the checks they did for this project align with what GCC or registry or the admin account finds. Okay, so I'm moving into the project verification report here. This is what we just submitted through the verifier account, and it should reflect here now. So we're going to go ahead and see the forward with comments, approve or reject. If I decided as a registry that maybe I saw something that doesn't align with the verifier, I could always select forward with comments and put any recommendations here. So it would be more descriptive if this were a real project, but we're just going to use this as an example to see if it reflects. And we're going to click save here. So what this is doing, where we're forwarding it to, is to the steering committee, where they can make the ultimate decision of registering this project or stopping it here. So I need to go to virtual user 3, which was that steering committee. And now I should have access to this document and to any notes that were captured there. Now to see the notes, I would click this drop down, and you'll see that we know GCC approved this, and they left this note here saying the findings did not align with the verifier. It could be in paragraph form, but we would see that reflect here. And then again, we can view this document and select register or reject. So I want to go ahead and register this project. And although it might seem like there's all these steps that are captured in such a short amount of time, because we are doing this webinar and trying to keep it in a decent time frame, usually this would be a longer process. So each user would have time to review all of this information and hit those approval or reject buttons. So now that we have registered the project, as a project owner, I should be able to submit monitoring reports now. So maybe I start my activities, I have a year of data collected, and now it's time for me to submit this monitoring report. Okay, so we would click on project verification, where right under we see add project monitoring report. And you should see this blue button here where we can go ahead and add that. So we have this value that's just referencing that submission number, making sure that we're sticking to the same project. We have all of that same information about the location. We are going to capture different data points here that are specific to the monitoring period. So we're outlining the year that we have data for, the duration of this monitoring period. There are times that it's shorter than a year, and you'll see that reflecting in the quantity of credits. What monitoring period number, so maybe my project's already been going on for 2 years, so I'll identify it as 2. The version number, completion date of this monitoring report, and then we would be referencing the project submission form that this monitoring report is associated with. So we have some info about the project owner. You'll see that we even describe how these credits are distributed. And then we're collecting information about the data points. We also have information in here now for the measuring, reading, and recording frequencies, the purpose of the data. And again, when you see this button in here as add entity, you can add multiple fields for everything that's captured here. So I could have multiple data points that I want to outline. I need to tell you where I referenced it, the unit that's associated with it. I can keep adding those data points by selecting this button here. And then we have the data points that are being monitored, the values associated with it. So that would be updated every monitoring period. We have information about risk management actions, sampling plans here, and you would put info if it's associated with your project. And we're selecting now the case that we'll be following for that quantification approach. So I have case 1. I'm putting in the value here for this first data point. Then I need to choose which option I'm going to be following for the emission factor, and I chose option 4. And now it's going to collect that data point. And then we've identified that we won't have project emissions by answering these questions. So we're not going to have you just input 0 or whatever your emissions came out to. We would just ask you these questions and then redirect you to any data points that need to be filled out if you do have any project emissions. And you'll see that there's nothing under leakage emissions because that's been hard-coded to 0. And within this methodology or business processes, they do ask you if there's been any difference in what you estimated versus what was the actual environmental benefit after you've done your activities and you've captured the real life data. You can go ahead and outline that here and explain why is there a difference. And we're going to go ahead and click create. So we're moving towards the end here now that we've submitted a monitoring report. We will be issuing credits very soon. We just have to create that verifier that is responsible. His responsibility is to verify only the monitoring report, not the project submission form. So we're going to do that now. Click that add user button. We should have a virtual user for, and we can assign their role. Okay, so we see we have that verifier role. Even though we have 2 different verifiers, you'd select that same option and select next, and we're going to have that form pop up to collect their information. Now that we've done that, we can go ahead and click next, click create. We have to go to that administrator, make sure that this account is trustworthy. We're checking all of their information and approving it. So we see them here. We can view that document, see everything that they submitted. and select approve. And then we're going down to the project monitoring. This is the report that was just submitted by the project owner, and we can go ahead and approve that. They also have access to that document. All the auto calculations that occur after submitting the document should reflect in there, and we would approve that. And now this leads us back to the project owner where I have to assign this new verifier. So I want to go ahead and go to project monitoring. You see it says assign verifier right under. This is the step that we're at. And under that assign column, we can add the verifier. So the demo information I use is very similar, but it would be our second option here. We could put unique names to make sure that it's easily identifiable and we know which verifier is which. Okay, so we're moving into that new verifier, which is virtual user 4. They need to check that monitoring report and go ahead and approve or reject it. So we won't see anything under project submission as they don't have access to that document. That document was made available to the first verifier that we used. They have access to the monitoring report. And here's a verifier. I can view the document, add my verification report. This verification report is different from the first verification report that was submitted. This is going to make sure that we're asking questions about the monitoring report and the emission reductions that are being claimed. Okay, so some of the stuff might look similar, like we still collect information about the verifier, their reference number, information about the project that they're verifying. You'll see that monitoring period, which came from the monitoring report. We also still collect info about the roles that are in this project, but then we start seeing different fields based off of compliance for that project monitoring report. And we want to make sure we know what the verification is, any findings and conclusions. That can all be outlined here for each one of these different compliance checks. And now if there were any clarification requests, corrective action requests, forwards action requests, you can add that in here, but it is optional in case this project didn't have any. You can still go ahead and move forward. And then we'll see the emission reductions that we're claiming. So as I mentioned, we will have a smaller number just to make sure that the demo moves quickly today. And we can click create here. You'll also see those credits reflecting above. Okay, so now we're moving back to the administrator. The project owner would also have access to these documents, but it would be view only. They can't alter anything or comment back to the verifier, but they can view the report for any verification findings that were listed in there. And we're moving into that emission reductions verification report. So again, you can forward with comments, approve, and the reject button we would have been able to scroll to. I'm going to go ahead and click approve. We could get to that trust chain. But our last step here is just going to the steering committee. So by clicking approve, that means that our findings as the registry or as the admin were the same as the verifier. And we can say that the monitoring report had no mistakes, everything looks good. So we were able to easily move forward here. And I would go to our steering committee, which was virtual user 3. They're going to be the ones who issue these credits. So usually we see this within the administrator's account, but for GCC, it is their steering committee that makes that ultimate decision. Now I'm selecting that emission reductions verification report. So you can view that document. This is going to be the verification report, not the monitoring report. And you'll see that we can issue these credits or just reject and say that it didn't qualify for the credits. So I'm going to go ahead and click issue. We know the quantity here, and you could also see the quantity within this document. And then we see these notifications here. So minting started, minting completed, we're transferring the tokens, and the transfer completed. And now we do have 2 users who have access to the trust chain. It would be our project owner, and the administrator has access to it as well. We can view it through the project owner for today's demo. So we want to make sure we navigate to that VPs tab. And here you'll see the hash associated with this mint, the date, and all the serials for the 55 tokens that we issued today. Then we can click View Trust Chain to get more information. So here you're seeing what's displayed as the verifiable presentation up top, the token and issuer. So here's our token ID, our recipient name, which would be virtual user 1, the project owner. The token amount, so we have 56 out of 56 minted, token transfer, the mint date, the verifiable signature here, and what policy we use. So you'll see that we have GCCM001, the description, the version that we were in dry run, and the issuer name. And then we're moving down to these different cards here. So each one of these are going to have our VC files, which could be thought of as a digital document where you're tracking all of this information that was submitted. So we have the policy being created by the administrator, the project submission form by the project owner, and we can open up these VC files to see all of the information again that was submitted. But what we're seeing is every role and every action that was taken throughout this whole workflow would be displayed down here, where you can see the proof associated with it. We know that all of this information was submitted, and it was submitted by this party. And it would show every single step all the way to that credit issuance. And again, we can see more information about this credit, the amount, the token ID, the date. But this just makes this whole system easily audible by anyone who wants to make sure that the credits that they're purchasing are trustworthy. We know that the data is there to back up those claims as evidence. If you're part of the community and you're interested in submitting, you can maybe it's submitting a policy, or you have a question or a bug that you need to report, you could do this through our GitHub. You could also find us on Discord at the Hedera channel, but on the sustainability channel that they have on Discord, or directly to Envision at our email. It would be support@guardianservice.io, or you could also find more information on our guardianservice.io website. Thank you everyone for joining, and we will be having another webinar next month, which would be focused on forestry. So if you're interested, we'd love to see you here again. Thank you.